Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of View from the Stars by Walter M. Miller and continue with Anybody Else Like Me. Her bedroom was hot and lonely, and she tossed in growing restlessness. If only Frank were home, but he would be gone for 2 more weeks. The children would be back on Monday, but that was 3 whole days away. Crazy. It was just stark raving crazy. Had the man really existed? What was his name? Kenneth Greerly? Or was he only a phantasm invented by a mind that was failing? Her mind. Dancing naked in the rain, calling out to shadow shapes in the brush, talking to a specter in the street, schizophrenic syndrome, dream world stuff. It could not be otherwise, for unless she had invented Kenneth Greerly, how could she know he had sore feet, an impacted wisdom tooth, and a head cold? Not only did she know about those things, she had felt them. She buried her face in the dusty pillow and sobbed. Tomorrow she would have to call Dr. Mensley. But fearing the specter's return, she arose a few minutes later and locked all the doors in the house. When she returned, she tried to pray, but it was as if prayer was being watched. Someone was listening, eavesdropping from outside. Kenneth Greerly appeared in her dreams, stood half shrouded in a slowly swirling fog. He stared at her with his head cocked aside, smiling slightly, holding his hat respectfully in his hands. "Don't you realize, Mrs. Waverly, that we are mutants, perhaps?" he asked politely. "No," she screamed. "I'm happily married. I have 3 children and a place in society. Don't come near me." He melted slowly into the fog, but echoes came monotonously from invisible cliffs. Mutant, 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 mutant. Dawn came splashing pink paint across the eastern sky. The light woke her to a dry and empty consciousness, to a headachy awareness full of dull anxiety. She arose wearily and trudged to the kitchen for a pot of coffee. Lord, couldn't it all only be a bad dream? In the cold light of early morning, the things of the past night looked somehow detached, unreal. She tried to analyze objectively. That sense of sharing a mind, a consciousness with the stranger who came out of the shadows. What crazy thing had he called it? Some sort of palpable biophysical energy form, analytical, definitely. If I invented the stranger, she thought, I must also have invented the words. But where had she heard such words before? Lisa went to the telephone and thumbed through the directory. No Greerly was listed. If he existed at all, he probably lived in a rooming house. The university, last night she had thought he had something to do with the university. She lifted the phone and dialed. "University station, number please," the operator said. I don't know the extension number. Could you tell me if there's a Kenneth Greerly connected with the school?" "Student or faculty, madam?" "I don't know. Give me your number, please, and I'll call you back." "Lawrence 4750. Thanks, operator." She sat down to wait. Almost immediately it rang again. "Hello, Mrs. Waverly, you were calling me?" A man's voice. His voice. "The operator found you rather quickly." It was the only thing she could think of saying. No, I knew you were calling. In fact, I hoped you into it." "Hoped me? Now look here, Mr. Greerly, you were trying to explain our phenomenon in terms of insanity rather than telepathy. I didn't want you to do that, and so I hoped you into calling me." Lisa was coldly speechless. "What phenomenon are you talking about?" she asked after a few dazed seconds. Still repressing it. "Listen, I can share your mind anytime I want to. Now that I understand where and who you are, you might as well face the fact. And it can work both ways if you let it. Up to now, you've been, well, keeping your mind's eye closed, so to speak." Her scalp was crawling. The whole thing had become intensely disgusting to her. I don't know what you're up to, Mr. Greerley, but I wish you'd stop it. I admit something strange is going on, but your explanation is ridiculous, offensive even. He was silent for a long time. Then, I wonder if the first man-ape found his prehensile thumb ridiculous. I wonder if he thought using his hands for grasping was offensive. What are you trying to say? I think we're mutants. We're not the first ones. I had the same experience when I was in Boston once. There must have been one of us there too, but suddenly I got the feeling that he had committed suicide. I never saw him again. We were probably the first ones to discover each other. Boston? If what you say is true, what would the distance have to do with it? Well, if telepathy exists, it certainly involves transfer of energy from one point to another. What kind of energy, I don't know. Possibly electromagnetic in character, but it seems likely that it would obey the inverse square law like radiant energy forms. I came to town about 3 weeks ago. I didn't feel you until I got close. There is a connection, she thought. She had been wondering about the increased anxiety in the past 3 weeks. I don't know what you're talking about, she evaded icily. I'm no mutant. I don't believe in telepathy. I'm not insane. Now let me alone. She slammed the telephone in its cradle and started to walk away. Evidently, he was angry, for she was suddenly communicating with him again. She reeled dizzily and clutched at the wall because she was in two places at once, and the two settings merged in her mind to become a blur, like a double exposure. She was in her own hallway, and she was also in an office looking at a calculator keyboard, hearing glassware rattling from across a corridor, aware of the smell of formaldehyde. There was a chart on the wall behind the desk, and it was covered with strange tracery, schematics of some neural arcs. The office of the psychophysics lab. She closed her eyes and her own hallway disappeared. She felt anger, his anger. We've got to face this thing. If this is a new direction for human evolution, then we'd better study it and see what to do about it. I knew I was different, and I became a psychophysicist to find out why. I haven't been able to measure much, but now, with Lisa's help, she tried to shut him out. She opened her eyes and summoned her strength and tried to force him away. She stared at the bright doorway, but the tracery of neural arcs still remained. She fought him, but his mind lingered in hers. Perhaps we can get to the bottom of it. I know my encephalograph recordings are abnormal, and now I can check them against hers. A few correlations will help. I'm glad to know about her soft fontanelle. I wondered about mine. Now I think that underneath that fontanelle lies a pattern of specialized neural. She sagged to the floor of the hall and babbled aloud, Hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck one. Slowly he withdrew. The laboratory office faded from her vision. His thoughts left her. She lay there panting for a time. Had she won? No, there was no sense in claiming victory. She had not driven him away. He had withdrawn of his own volition when he felt her babbling. She knew his withdrawal was free because she had felt his parting mind in its state of sadness. He had stopped the forced contact because he pitied her, and there was a trace of contempt in the pity. She climbed slowly to her feet, looking around wildly, touching the walls and the door frame to reassure herself that she was still in her own home. She staggered into the parlor and sat shivering on the sofa. Last night, that crazy running around in the rain, he was responsible for that. He had hoped her into doing it, or maybe he had just wondered what she looked like undressed, and she had subconsciously satisfied his curiosity. He had planted the suggestion, innocently perhaps, and she had unknowingly taken the cue. He could be with her whenever he wanted to. He had been with her while she frolicked insanely in the rain-trodden grass. Perhaps he was with her now. Whom should she talk to? Where could she seek help? Dr. Mensley? He would immediately chalk it up as a delusion and probably call for a sanity hearing if she couldn't voluntarily enter a psycho ward for observation. The police? Sergeant, I want to report a telepathic prowler. A man is burglarizing my mind. A clergyman? He would shudder and refer her to a psychiatrist. All roads led to the booby hatch, it seemed. Frank wouldn't believe her. No one would believe her. She wandered through the day like a caged animal. She put on her brightest summer frock and a pert straw hat and went downtown. She wandered through the crowds in the business district window shopping, but she was alone. The herds of people about her brushed past and wandered on. A man whistled at her in front of a cigar store. A policeman waved her back to the curb when she started through the intersection. Wake up, lady, he called irritably. People all about her, but she could not tell them, explain to them, and so she was alone. She caught a taxi and went to visit a friend, the wife of an English teacher, and drank a glass of iced tea in her friend's parlor and talked of small things and admitted that she was tired when the friend suggested that she looked that way. When she went back home, the sun was sinking in the west. She called long distance and talked to her mother, then spoke to her children, asked them if they were ready to come home, but they wanted to stay another week. They begged, and her mother begged, and she reluctantly consented. It had been a mistake to call. Now the kids would be gone even longer. She tried to call Frank in St. Louis, but the hotel clerk reported he had just checked out. Lisa knew this meant he was on the road again. Maybe I ought to go join the kids at Mother's, she thought. But Frank had wanted her to stay home. He was expecting a registered letter from Chicago, and it was apparently important, and she had to take care of it. I'll invite somebody over, she thought. But the wives were home with their husbands, and it was a social mistake to invite a couple when her husband was gone. It always wound up with two women yammering at each other while the lone male sat and glowered in uneasy isolation, occasionally disagreeing with his wife just to let her know he was there and he was annoyed and bored and why couldn't they go home. It was different if the business widow called on a couple. Then the lone male could retire to some other part of the house to escape the yammering. But she decided it wasn't company she wanted. She wanted help, and there was no place to get it. When she allowed her thoughts to drift toward Kenneth Greerley, it was almost like tuning in a radio station. He was eating early dinner in the university cafeteria with a bedraggled, bespectacled brunette from the laboratory. Lisa closed her eyes and let herself sift gingerly into his thoughts. His attention was on the conversation and on the food, and he failed to realize Lisa's presence. That knowledge gave her courage. He was eating Swiss steak and hashed brown potatoes, and the flavors formed perceptions in her mind. She heard the rattle of silverware, the low murmur of voices, and smelled the food. She marveled at it. The strange ability had apparently been brought into focus by learning what it was and how to use it. Our work has been too empirical, he was saying. We've studied phenomena, gathered data, looked for correlations, but that method has limitations. We should try to find a way to approach psychology from below, like the invariant approach to physics. The girl shook her head. The nervous system is too complicated for writing theoretical equations about it. Empirical equations are the best we can do. They aren't good enough, Sarah. You can predict results with them inside the limits of their accuracy, but you can't extrapolate them very well, and they won't stack up together into a single integrated structure. And when you're investigating a new field, they no longer apply. We need a broad mathematical theory covering all hypothetically possible neural arrangements. It would let us predict not only results, but patterns of possible order. Seems to me the possible patterns are infinite. No, Sarah, they're limited by the nature of the building blocks, neurons, synaptic connections, and so forth. With limited materials, you have structural limitations. You don't build skyscrapers out of modeling clay, and there is only a finite number of ways you can build atoms out of electrons, protons, and neutrons. Similarly, brains are confined to the limitations of the things they're made of. We need a broad theory for defining limits. Why? Because he paused. Lisa felt his urge to explain his urgency, felt him suppress it, felt for a moment his loneliness in the awareness of his uniqueness and the way it isolated him from humanity. You must be doing new work, the girl offered, if you feel the lack of such a theoretical approach. I just can't imagine an invariant approach to psychology or an all-defining set of laws for it either. Why do you need a psychological relativity? He hesitated, frowning down at his plate, watching a fly crawl around the rim. I'm interested in the quantitative aspects of nerve impulses. I suspect that there can be such a thing as neural resonance. She laughed politely and shook her head. I'll stick to my empirical data gathering, thank you. Lisa felt him thinking. She could understand if I could show her the data, but my data is all subjective, experimental, personal. I share it with that Waverly woman, but she is only a social thinker, analytically shallow, refusing even to recognize facts. Why did it have to be her? She's flighty, emotional, and in a cultural rut. If she doesn't conform, she thinks she's nuts. But then at least she's a woman, and if this is really a mutation, we'll have to arrange for some children. Lisa gasped and sat bolt upright. Her shock revealed her presence to him, and he dropped his fork with a clatter. Lisa? She wrenched herself free of him abruptly. She angrily stalked about the house, slamming doors and muttering her rage. The nerve! The maddening, presumptuous, ill-mannered, self-centered, overly educated boor. Arrange for some children, indeed. An impossible situation. As her anger gathered momentum, she contacted him again, like a snake striking. Thought was thunder out of a dark cloud. I'm a decent and respectable woman, Mr. Gurley. I have a husband and 3 fine children, and I love them, and you can go to hell. I never want to see you again or have you prowling around my mind. Get out and stay out, and if you ever bother me again, I'll kill you. He was outdoors, striding across the campus alone. She saw the gray buildings, immersed in twilight, felt the wind on his face, hated him. He was thinking nothing, letting himself follow her angry flow of thought. When she finished, his thoughts began like a passionate pleading of a poem. He was imagining a human race with telepathic abilities, in near perfect communion with one another. So many of the world's troubles could be traced to imperfect communication of ideas, to misunderstandings. Then he thought briefly of Sarah, the nondescript laboratory girl he'd taken to dinner, and Lisa realized he was in love with Sarah. There was sadness and resentment here. He couldn't have Sarah now, not if he were to be certain of perpetuating the mutant characteristic. The Waverly woman ought to be good for 3 or 4 children yet before she reached middle age. Lisa stood transfixed by shock. Then he was thinking directly at her. I'm sorry. You're a beautiful, intelligent woman, but I don't love you. We're not alike, but I'm stuck with you and you're stuck with me because I've decided it's going to be that way. I can't convince you since your thinking habits are already fixed, so I won't even try. I'm sorry it has to be against your will, but in any event, it has to be. And now that I know what you're like, I don't dare wait for fear you'll do something to mess things up. No, she screamed, watching the scenery that moved past his field of vision. He had left the campus and was walking up the street toward her neighborhood. He was walking with the briskness of purpose. He was coming to her house. Call the police, she thought, and tried to dissolve him out of her mind. But this time he followed, clung to her thoughts, would not let her go. It was like 2 flashlight beams playing over a wall, one trying to escape, the other following its frantic circle of brightness. She staggered, groped her way toward the hall, which was confused with a superimposed image of a sidewalk and a street. A phantom automobile came out of the hall wall, drove through her, and vanished. Double exposures. He stared at a streetlight, and it blinded her. At last she found the phone, but he was laughing at her. 11/7/6/5/21. Mary had a little lamb. 7/7/76. Yesterday was May, March, April. He was deliberately filling her mind with confusion. She fumbled at the directory, trying to find the police, but he thought a confused jumble of numbers and symbols, and they sprang across the page, blurring the letters. She whimpered and groped at the phone dial, trying to get the operator, but he was doing something with her fingertips, and she couldn't get the feel of the dial. On her 3rd try, it finally worked. Information, said a pleasant, impersonal voice. She had to get the police. She had to say, peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge pot, peas 9 days old, pretty Polly Parrot, peacefully played, plenty-wise, peas porridge hot. He was jamming her speech centers with gibberish, and she blurted nonsense syllables into the mouthpiece. You'll have to speak more distinctly, madam. I can't understand you. Police, the police, just a moment. A series of jumbled sounds and visions clouded her mind. Then a masculine voice rumbled, "Desk, Sergeant Harris." She found a clear path through the confusion and gasped, 3003 Willow Drive. Emergency. Come quick. Man going to 3003 Willow. Check. We'll have a car right over there. She hung up quickly, or tried to, but she couldn't find the cradle. Then her vision cleared and she screamed. She wasn't in the hall at all. The telephone was an egg beater. His voice came through her trapped panic. "You might as well give in," he told her with a note of sadness. "I know how to mess you up like that, you see, and you haven't learned to retaliate yet. We're going to cooperate with this evolutionary trend, whether you like it or not, but it would be more pleasant if you agreed to it." "No!" "All right, but I'm coming anyway. I hoped it wouldn't be like this. I wanted to convince you gradually. Now I know that's impossible." He was still 10 blocks away. She had a few minutes in which to escape. She bolted for the door. A black shadow shape loomed up in the twilight, flung its arms wide, and emitted an ape-like roar. She yelped and darted back, fleeing frantically for the front. A boa constrictor lay coiled in the hall. It slithered toward her. She screamed again and raced toward the stairway. She made it to the top and looked back. The living room was filling slowly with murky water. She rushed shrieking into the bedroom and bolted the door. She smelled smoke. Her dress was on fire. The flames licked up, searing her skin. She tore at it madly and got it off, but her slip was afire. She ripped it away, scooped up the flaming clothing on a transom hook, opened the screen, and dropped them out the window. Flames still licked about her, and she rolled up in the bedclothing to snuff them out. Quiet laughter. "New syndrome," he called to her pleasantly. "The patient confuses someone else's fantasy with her own reality. Not schizophrenia. Duophrenia, maybe?" She lay sobbing in hysterical desperation. He was just down the street now, coming rapidly up the walk. A car whisked slowly past. He felt her terrified despair and pitied her. The torment ceased. She stayed there, panting for a moment, summoning spirit. He was nearly at the intersection just 2 blocks south, and she could hear the rapid traffic with his ears. Suddenly, she clenched her eyes closed and gritted her teeth. He was stepping off the curb, walking across. She imagined a fire engine thundering toward her like a juggernaut, rumbling and wailing. She imagined another car racing into the intersection with herself caught in the crossfire. She imagined a woman screaming, "Look out, mister!" And then she was caught in his own responding fright, and it was easier to imagine. He was bolting for the other corner. She conjured a third car from another direction, brought it lunging at him to avoid the impending wreck. He staggered away from the phantom cars and screamed. A real car confused the scene. She echoed his scream. There was a moment of rending pain, and then the vision was gone. Brakes were still yowling 2 blocks away. Someone was running down the sidewalk. A part of her mind heard the crashing thud. She was desperately sick. And a sudden sense of complete aloneness told her that Greerly was dead. A siren was approaching out of the distance. Voices from the sidewalk. "Just threw a fit in the middle of the street, running around like crazy and hollering. It was a delivery truck. Crushed his skull. Nobody else hurt." After the street returned to normal, she arose and went to get a drink of water. But she stood staring at her sick white face in the mirror. There were crow's feet forming at the corners of her eyes, and her skin was growing tired, almost middle-aged. It was funny that she should notice that now, at this strange moment. She had just killed a man in self-defense, and no one would believe it if she told the truth. There was no cause for guilt, was there? Frank would be back soon, and everything would be the same again. Peace, security, nice kids, nice home, nice husband, just the way it always had been. But something was already different, an emptiness, a loneliness of the mind that she had never felt before. She kept looking around to see if the lights hadn't gone dim, or the clock stopped ticking, or the faucet stopped dripping. It was none of those things. The awful silence was within her. Gingerly, she touched the soft spot on the top of her head and felt an utter aloneness. She closed her eyes and thought a hopeless plea to the universe. Is there anybody else like me? Can anybody hear me? There was only complete silence, the silence of the voiceless void. And for the first time in her life, she felt the confinement of total isolation and knew it for what it was. And next time, we will continue with readings from The View from the Stars.